Man, I love that last song. Just powerful to worship the Lord. Thank you, worship team, and again, congregation, just for being a family that worships together. This morning I want to start with a hypothetical. Let's just say that I really like this picture, and I like it so much that I'm going to put it on my wall in my living room. I'm going to hang it on the wall. That way everybody can see it when they come into the living room. But I discover, as people come in and look at it, that not everybody likes it as much as I do. In fact, some people dislike it. Some even would say they hate it. Some would even make fun of me and tease me and say, Darrell, I can't believe you would like that picture. So because of that, I now have a choice to make. On one hand, I like the picture and I want to display it in my house. On the other hand, I don't want to offend people. I certainly don't want people to tease me and make fun of me. So I have a choice. What do I do? Well, I have two choices. The first is I can choose to appease the people that dislike it. Now, I can do that in a variety of ways. So, for example, to appease them, maybe I would decide, well, I'll just replace the picture. I'll take that one down and I'll put up a picture that I think everybody would like, and when they come in, no one's offended, no one's going to tease me, and I'll just replace it with a different picture. That's one option. Well, let's say I don't like that option. But let's say instead of replacing it, as people come in, instead of replacing it, I'm just going to remove it. I'm not going to have anything hanging on my wall. That way when people come in, they don't see anything. There's no way I can be teased about anything, or I'll just remove it. Or I could redo it. I could go get some markers, some crayons, some paint brushes, some watercolors, and man, I'll just start here and I'll just create a picture that I think everybody would like. Or I could just decide I'm just going to cover it up. When people show up at my house that don't like the picture, I'll just cover it up, and that way they don't have to look at it. So I could choose to appease the people that dislike it. The second choice is I could say, you know what? This is my house. This is my living room. I like this picture, so I'll put it up here if I want to. I'm going to do what I want to because it's my house. It's my picture. Yeah, thank you. Now, this is the choice really that we see in today's OTC. Today we're going to be in the book of Daniel. And we're going to look at a variety of passages throughout Daniel. We're continuing our series entitled OTC, where we're looking at Old Testament characters, their story, their lives, and trying to apply it to our own story and our own lives. And today's OTC is Daniel, the man Daniel. Now, I think he's probably most well known for being in the lion's den, but there's a lot more to his story than just that. And so today we're going to look at a variety of passages throughout portions of the book of Daniel to see choices that Daniel made. And the point of the message this morning is that we would make the same choices that Daniel made when we find ourselves in the same or similar circumstances and situations. Now, before we get to the choices, need to lay a little groundwork, give a little context. So in chapter 9, we see a prayer that Daniel prays. And in that prayer, he exposes a couple of truths that he held to and he held on to. I'm not going to read the entire prayer, but just a few verses so we can get these two truths. Chapter 9, verse 4 says, I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with all who love him and obey his commands, we have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and have rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. Verse 7, Lord, you are righteous, but this day we are covered with shame. The last of verse 7, you have scattered us because of our unfaithfulness to you. Verse 9, the Lord our God is merciful and forgiving, even though we have rebelled against him. Verse 15, now, O Lord our God, who brought your people out of Egypt with a mighty hand and who made for yourself a name that endures to this day, we have sinned. 18, give ear, O God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. That last verse reminds me of a song by Casting Crowns. It's entitled All Because of Mercy. Part of the chorus simply says, I know the only reason I can stand here unashamed, it's not because I'm worthy. It's all because of mercy. In this prayer, we see two truths that Daniel acknowledges. One is who God is and what He has done. The other is who He is and what He has done. And I think these two truths lay as a foundation supporting his entire story and choices and situation. On the one hand, he proclaims who God is. He proclaims, he understands that God is great and awesome and righteous and merciful, forgiving, powerful, that He exudes love, He exudes faithfulness, that He blesses His children and His people as they seek to follow after His way and after His will. But then He also admits and confesses His own sin and the sin of His people. Now you have to remember that Daniel here is in exile. But Daniel doesn't blame God for being in captivity in Babylon. He does not question the goodness of God or the power of God since he's in captivity. He doesn't think God's unfair for allowing him to go into captivity. Rather, he says, you're very justified in what you've done. He continues to affirm God and affirm who He is, all that He does, even though he's in this situation. Now, if you'll flip back to chapter 1, verse 1, we see a little bit more context. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So King Nebuchadnezzar attacks Jerusalem, defeats it, and that's somewhere around 605 BC, give or take. Verse 3 says, The king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. So the king wants the best of the best in his service, the cream of the crop, the elite. Verse 4 says that they were strong, they were handsome, they were smart. So it's the best of the best to serve him. And verse 6 says, among those were some from Judah, which includes Daniel. So from our perspective, we're introduced to Daniel somewhere around this 605 BC timeline. And remember, he is now a captive. He is an exile. He is, in all essence, a prisoner of war. Now, when you kind of fast forward to chapter 6, that's the chapter that deals with that very familiar story, Daniel in the lion's den. That event occurred somewhere around 539 BC, about 66 years later. I don't know if you've thought about it, but most scholars believe that Daniel was somewhere in his late 70s or maybe even 80 years old when he was thrown into the lion's den. Now, this prayer that we just read part of, that prayer was prayed, scholars say, somewhere around this time of the lion's den, somewhere around the 539, 538, somewhere. In other words, this prayer that we read, he prayed a little later in life. But I believe that he held firm to those same truths very early in life. I think he held on to them even before the captivity, and I think it's because he was so firmly rooted in these truths that he is able to make some of the choices that we're going to look at here in just a moment. So this morning, I want to look at 5 choices that Daniel makes with the hopes that we would follow his example and we would make those same choices when we're faced and put in the same kind of situations that he is. So here's choice 1. Daniel chose to be unwavering. He chose to be unwavering in his faith. We read part of this prayer and we noted that he confesses and he acknowledges God's greatness, His goodness, His mercy, His faithfulness, all of that. And I think he believed that early on, even before captivity. I think he was raised in such a place where he believed those and he trusted those and he knew who God was. He believed who God was. But now that he's in captivity, it would have been very easy for him to bail on his faith. He could very well have said, God's not good. God's not powerful. God's not faithful. Because if he were any of those things, I would not be in captivity. I would not be in Babylon in these days. But he doesn't do that. He holds on to it. He could have adopted the gods of the Babylonians. Because a common thought back in that day was whichever army defeats the other army, their gods must have been stronger than these gods. So he could have said, since the Babylonians defeated us, the Babylonian gods must be stronger and greater than my God. But he doesn't do that. Doubt, disbelief, discouragement, disillusionment, all of those things could have taken over his heart and his spirit. But none of them do. Why? Because he chose to stand unwavering in his faith. That brings a second choice. He chooses to be undefiled. If you look in chapter 1, verse 8, it says that Daniel resolved, and that's a strong commitment. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. That word defile means to stain or to make unclean. Later in Daniel, we also see that he applies that same concept to his mind. He did not want to defile his mind. What we see in Daniel's story is he made a choice not to defile himself. He wanted to be undefiled in every area of his life. This chapter 1, the food is just one example of those. So we see that he has this commitment to holiness. He has a commitment to living life God's way by God's design. So in these first two choices, we see that Daniel chooses to be and stay faithful to God. Remember, he's a slave. He's a POW. He's in a situation that he does not want to be in. Now, for the most part, he was treated pretty well while he was in Babylon. But he was by no means a free man. And I'm sure that he did not want to be in the situation that he was in. But even though he was in that situation, he continued to be unwavering in his faith, undefiled, to be faithful to God. And here's a spiritual point for us to apply. That is to be faithful where you are. Be faithful to the Lord where you are. You know, it's really easy to say, you know, I'm looking for X. And so when I attain X, then I'll serve the Lord and I'll be faithful to Christ and I'll live for Christ once I can attain X. So, you know, I'm single right now and I really got a lot of things to do. So once I get married, I'll begin to live for Jesus. Or, you know, I'm trying to get this job. I'm not really financially secure. Once I can get that job, once I can kind of get some financial security, then I'll begin to live for Jesus and follow after him. Or when I get that big promotion, I'll stand up for Christ. When I get X, whatever X may be, the truth here and the application, the example here is be faithful to God right where you are. And you may be in a place that you don't love right now. There may be situations and dynamics going on in your life that are not favorable in your mind. But don't say, hey, when I get all these issues, when I get all these situations, when I get all these details taken care of, then I'll live for Jesus. No, do it right now. Be faithful right where you are. This leads to his third choice. Thirdly, he chose to be unintimidated. He was not intimidated at all. We see this through several aspects of his story. In chapter 1, we see that this chief official is going to give the royal food and the wine to all these guys so that they can eat. Well, Daniel doesn't want to eat that food. And so he's unintimidated. He approaches the official and says, hey, let us just have some vegetables and water. Well, even after that, official's a little hesitant because he's afraid of what the king's going to do to him if these guys end up in bad condition. Daniel's still unintimidated. In verse 12, he says, okay, please test your servants for 10 days and give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. He is so unintimidated, he is saying, hey, we're going to be better than all these other guys. He knew he was right. Why? Because he was living life God's way. He knew doing it God's way was the best way. So he was unintimidated by what the officials were talking about. He said, hey, let us eat this, and I guarantee you we're going to be in better shape. He's also unintimidated by all these other men that are part of this big group that are going to serve the king. Think about this. This could actually be a little comical if you thought about it this way. Here you have all these guys. They're all eating the royal food and drinking the royal wine. They are having the best of the best. Back in that day, the king's spread, it was the best of the best. All the kinds of meats you can eat, the best of meat, the best desserts. It's like it's ongoing all-you-can-eat buffet. Think about your favorite restaurant with the best food that you like, being able to eat that all day, every day. That's what's going on here. But then all of a sudden, Daniel does this little deal, and now everybody has to eat his diet, and so now everybody's eating vegetables and drinking water. I would be ticked. And you know these guys had to be ticked. Daniel, what in the world are you doing? We had all this food, and now we're eating vegetables. He still stood unintimidated, even to these guys, because he knew his way was the right way. We also see it in chapter 2. In chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he doesn't know what the dream means, so he tries to call in all of his enchanters and magicians and all his wise men to interpret the dream. Well, they can't interpret his dream. And he gets so mad that he orders every wise man in his kingdom to be executed. And that includes Daniel. So Daniel goes, he spends a little time with the Lord. And then he approaches Arioch, who is the executioner. He is so unintimidated that he looks at his executioner face to face and says, let me go see the king. Let me talk to the king. He was unintimidated. Why? Because he knew his way was the right way. Here's another great spiritual application for us. Don't let people intimidate you from living for Jesus Christ. Don't let anybody bully you or push you around and keep you from standing and living for Christ and standing strong in your faith. Don't let the enemy, don't let our spiritual enemy intimidate us and say that we have no right to share Christ and to live for Christ. Don't let your situation, your circumstances intimidate you. You just make that decision. I'm going to be unintimidated, and I'm going to be in that world, not obnoxious, but I'm going to live out my faith for Christ and my love for Christ very boldly, very proudly. This leads to the fourth choice. He also chose to be unashamed. And they're kind of interconnected. They're interlinked. He was unashamed. If you go back to chapter 1, the story of him eating all this food, there was a period of, 10 days where Daniel and I think a few others are eating the vegetables. All these other guys are eating the royal food. Don't you know that all these other guys, before they hear the end of the story and they have to eat the vegetables too, they're looking at Daniel saying, Daniel, what are you doing? You've got all this food to your disposal. Anything you want to eat and drink, you have. And you're just eating vegetables. Don't you know that they gave him a hard time? He was unashamed. He said, I know what I'm doing. I'm being obedient to my God. We also see it in chapter 2. Once the king, he has this dream that he wants interpreted, and he's ordered this execution. Well, Daniel's decided to come and approach the king and interpret the dream. And so the king asked Daniel, so you can interpret the dream? And in chapter 2, verse 27, Daniel replied, no. No, I can't. In fact, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about. He tells the king, there's no person that can interpret your dream. He goes on and says, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He's unashamed to stand up for his God. He says, nobody can do what you're asking, but I know a God. And my God can do this. We also see in chapter 6, when you get around the story of the lion's den, we see in verse 10, that's Daniel's praying 3 times a day in his room, by a window, with his window open. Remember, he's in a foreign land. He's in a pagan land. He's in a land that worships other gods. He's in a land where being a follower of Yahweh is in the minority, where he could be disciplined, but yet he continues to be unashamed in his walk and in his relationship with God, that he continues to pray and do what he's always done. He was unashamed. And that brings us to the fifth choice. Kind of wraps it all together. He chose to be undeterred in his commitment to follow after God and live life by his design and his commands. He was undeterred in that commitment. When you look in chapter 6, we see this story taking place, and what's happening is there are some officials of the king that coerce the king to make a decree. And that decree is that no one, for a period of time, no one can pray to a god or pray to a man other than to the king. And if anybody prays to any other god, they will be thrown into the lion's den. Now, these officials did that because they were jealous of Daniel. Daniel was rising up in the kingdom. He was so impressive to the king. He stood out so much to the king that the king is going to make him the ruler over the entire kingdom, number one in all the kingdom. Well, these other officials, they couldn't have that. And so they're going to try to attack Daniel, discredit Daniel, so that he won't have that position. But the scripture tells us they could find no fault in his work ethic. They could find no fault in his conduct. They could find no fault in his character. The only thing they could attack was his relationship with his God. So that's why they make this decree, that anybody that prays to a God, they knew Daniel prayed to his God. So anybody that prays to God is going to be thrown in the lion's den. So what does Daniel do? Look in chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, this is a powerful sentence. What it tells us is Daniel knew exactly what was going on. He knew exactly what the edict that had been laid out, and he knew beyond a shadow of doubt that if he prays to his God, he will be thrown into the lion's den. He knew that. So what did he do? Verse 10 goes on and says, he went home to his upstairs room where the window opened toward Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got on his knees, he prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Here's a man who was so committed to his God and to his faith. 3 times a day, he's praying in this place with the window open so everyone knew. And now, knowing that he would be thrown in the lion's den if he did that, he continued to do it just like he had been doing it. He was undeterred in his pursuit of God, in his faithfulness of God, in his obedience to God. He chose to follow God regardless of the consequences. He chose to follow God even knowing what the consequences would be. There's another spiritual truth here for us this morning. When you think about it, it's easy to follow Jesus when it's easy to follow Jesus. It's hard to follow Jesus when it gets hard to follow Jesus. You know what that's saying? When things are easy, when there's no consequences, when there's no blowback, when there's nothing that's going to happen to us negatively, it's easy to live for Jesus. It's easy to live out our faith knowing that nothing negative is going to happen. But it's another thing to live for Jesus when you know there's going to be blowback, when you know there's going to be consequences, when you know there's going to be persecution, when you know something negative is going to happen. That's a whole different ballgame. Daniel was determined, even in the midst of the consequences, to follow after his God. And it's an example for us that we would be so undeterred in our faith that even knowing that there may be consequences to loving Christ and following Christ and speaking out for Christ, that we do it anyway. Now in America, if we continue in our spiritual trajectory, if we continue to go the direction that our nation is currently heading, there will come a day when we will be just like Daniel. There will come a day to follow Christ, to live for Christ, to speak out for Christ is going to carry with it some significant potential consequences. May we be undeterred like Daniel. This leads to a 6th point. This is not a 6th choice. This is a result of the 5 choices. In other words, because Daniel chose to be unwavering and undefiled and unintimidated, unashamed, undeterred, he was undisappointed. I know that's not a word. I had to keep my thing. He was undisappointed. He knew that what he was doing was right, and God sustained that and proved that he was indeed doing the right thing. Daniel could have chosen to eat the king's food. Daniel could have chosen to stay quiet about God's wisdom and insight. Daniel could have chosen to close that window when he was praying or just quit praying. He could have chosen to worship the Babylonian gods, but he doesn't. He chooses to stay faithful. And the truth this morning is you have the same choice. Jesus Christ will not make you love him. He will not make you follow him. He will not make you obey him. He will not make you proclaim him. He will not make you serve him. You get the choice. You get to choose your response. You get to choose your lifestyle. But the truth is the same as the story of Daniel. If you'll choose to live for Christ the way Daniel lived for God, you will be undisappointed, because it is the best way to live. Let me finish with just two quick observations about Daniel. One is that Daniel did not pursue the 3 P's: power, position, and prestige. Daniel did not pursue power. He did not pursue a position. He did not pursue prestige. Now, God put him in a very powerful position, but not because he was pursuing it. It was because he was pursuing God. Daniel pursued God, and he let God put him wherever he needed to be where God wanted him to be. He did not pursue the 3 P's. Secondly, Daniel was not trying, I don't think, to be a change agent. He was not trying to be a change agent in this world. His goal was not to be a change agent. Daniel's goal was not to be countercultural, even though he lived life counterculturally. Daniel's goal was not to be controversial. He wasn't trying to just create a lot of trouble. Daniel's goal was not to change society. He wasn't trying to make Babylon be Israel. He was not trying to change the mindset of the king, of the ruling party. He was simply being faithful to God. He was simply trying to live his life exactly the way God had ordained and called and led him to live. Now, because he did that, he became a change agent. And there's some good practical truth for us this morning as we close out. One, don't get caught up pursuing the 3 P's. Don't pursue power. Don't pursue positions. Don't pursue prestige. Your goal and heart should be, as a follower of Christ, to pursue Jesus Christ. You pursue him, and you let him put you wherever you need to be to most honor him and glorify him and fulfill the calling that he has on your life. And don't make it your goal to be a change agent. You just surrender to Christ and say, God, I'm yours. I'm surrendered. Whatever you want to do with me, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to be faithful to you. I'm going to love you. I'm going to proclaim you. If you will do that, if you will be unwavering and undefiled and unintimidated, unashamed, undeterred in your walk, I guarantee you that you will become a change agent in your world as well. So it really all kind of comes back to this picture. Don't try to appease people. You just proudly proclaim, I'm a follower of Christ, and you live for him, come what may. Would you bow your heads with me? Daniel gives us a great example what it means just to be one person, humbly and faithfully trying to live out his faith and proclaim his love for his God. May that be our hearts this morning. That our only heart's desire is to pursue Christ, know Christ, love Christ, and allow him to use us any way and every way he chooses. I pray that would be your heart this morning. In just a moment, we're going to observe communion together. But I want to give you a few moments just in the silence of this time and the quietness of your heart to prepare your heart and just think about this concept of living for Christ. There's an old saying, it's kind of cliche, but it's very true, that Jesus Christ died for me, so I should live for him. I mean, the least I can do for the one who died for me is to live for him. I just want you to think about that concept as you prepare your heart for communion. Knowing that all that Christ has done for us, his death on the cross, his sacrifice for us, may our hearts simply be in gratitude, I'll live for you. So take a moment, allow the Spirit just to speak and minister. You pray whatever's on your heart, whatever the Spirit's speaking to you, just use this time as preparation, and then we'll observe communion together in just a moment. In the spirit of worship, I invite you to take your elements. Take a moment and just pull out the top piece and pull out the wafer. Give you a moment to do that. Because when Jesus met with his disciples, that he had this time together. And he took the bread and he said, "This is my body, it's broken for you, so take and do this in remembrance of me." And it said he took his cup and said, "This is my blood. It's for the forgiveness of sin. So take and do this in remembrance of me." Father, we just come this morning proclaiming our love for you, our thanks to you, our gratitude for you. Thank you that you loved us so much. You gave your only begotten Son, that whosoever would believe would not perish but have everlasting life. We thank you for that life. Father, if there's anyone here this morning that's not experienced that life, I pray that you would prompt them so we can have a conversation, that you would reveal your love to them. Father, as we continue our worship this morning, we give our hearts, we give our lives, we give our spirit, we give our weakness, we give our failures, we give everything to you. We put it in your hands and just pray that you would use us, you would shape us, you would change us. May we be modern day Daniels for you. In Jesus' name, amen.